Well, tēnā koutou katoa, good morning everybody. Thank you for joining me bright and early on this wonderful Wellington morning. I read recently one of the keys to success in life is to do the hard stuff first thing in the morning. So as we gather here for an early conversation about this year's government budget, it is a good time for us to have some hard, honest conversations about the crossroads that our country finds itself at. Because I think we are at a moment that requires some honesty, a moment that demands leadership, and above all, a moment that demands hope. So let's start with the tough stuff up front, perhaps the most contemporary issue of the day. Paying for your budget at the expense of women, cutting their chance at fair pay, is the opposite of all of those things that I've just mentioned. I think the reaction over the past week to the government's changes to pay equity has been swift, strong, and totally justified. Women all over this country have made it very clear they felt like pay equity was something they'd fought hard for, and in some cases devoted their lives to fighting for. It was hard fought, and we were as a country making progress. I want to be very clear here, as I said yesterday. I think over the last week we've seen the biggest example of a New Zealand government gaslighting half the population that we have ever seen. Telling women that cutting their pay on one hand, that they aren't cutting their pay on one hand, whilst cancelling 33 active pay equity claims with one stroke of a pen, with no due process, on the other hand, simply is dishonest. Claiming it wasn't to pay for their budget, then admitting that their changes will see billions slashed from that very same budget shows what their real agenda here is. I think that one of the reasons that this is resonating so strongly with New Zealanders up and down the country is because the promises that they were sold at the last election have too readily turned to dust. New Zealanders were told the economy would be stronger, but it's been slower. They were told that the cost of living would come down, and yet prices have continued to go up. New Zealanders were told families with kids would get an extra $250 a fortnight to pay the bills, and yet only a tiny handful of families have benefited from that. They're told the government would get things moving, and yet building projects across the country have ground to a halt, and at most recent count, around 13,000 people working in the construction industry have lost their jobs. New Zealanders were told the country would be more united, and yet it feels more divided than it ever has before. At every turn, when people ask, why can't we invest in our schools, in our hospitals, and in our future, the government is giving them the same answer. There is no alternative. But let me be very clear, there is always an alternative, and there are always choices. And this government makes the wrong choices. A $3 billion tax break for landlords, while cutting funding for things like pay equity for women. A rollback of our world-leading smoke-free laws, at the same time they gave over $200 million in tax breaks to the tobacco companies that produce the cigarettes. Borrowing $12 billion extra to pay for tax cuts, whilst cutting investment and cutting hope for future generations. They are choosing austerity. Nicola Willis doesn't like that word, but it's absolutely true. They're choosing decline and choosing division. I think we should choose a different path, a better path and a fairer path. One that puts people at the heart of our economy and decency back at the heart of our politics. We've done that before and we can do it again. There are huge challenges ahead. Challenges like the rise of artificial intelligence and the changing nature of work that's going to prompt. The climate crisis and the energy transition that's going to demand. An ageing population in need of care and dignity. The widening gap between rich and poor, between city and region, between young and old. And the creeping polarisation that seeks to divide us when what we need to do most is to come together. What is the government's response now to those challenges? Deregulate here, privatise there. If it moves, sell it. If it breaks, blame somebody else. It's a government more interested in finding someone else to blame than solving the problems facing the country. And they're trying to solve problems with the problems of the 21st century with ideas from the 19th century. They don't have a plan for the future. They have just slogans and spreadsheets. We do have a plan, a serious, credible, ambitious one that's rooted in fairness, decency and community, one that believes in people and one that backs New Zealand. Labour Party is the party that governs for all, not just the few. So let's start with the economy, because you can't build anything if your foundations are crumbling. The current government loves to repeat the myth that New Zealand is drowning in debt. So let's look at the facts. Before COVID-19 arrived, our core Crown debt was around 18%. After the pandemic, it peaked at 40%. That is an increase, but it's broadly in line with the increase in government net debt that we saw during the global financial crisis, when government debt increased by 20% under the last national government. And in fact, if you include our assets, like the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, in fact our net debt only sits at around 25%, one of the lowest levels of government debt in the developed world. You wouldn't sell your house because you've got a mortgage that you can easily pay, so why would you sell your public assets and slash government spending when there isn't a crisis? But net debt isn't the full story either, because you've also got to look at what you're buying. The government's net worth more than doubled over the last decade, from 81 billion in 2014 to 191 billion in 2023. We need to have a more mature conversation about government debt and assets than the one that we're having at the moment. Borrowing money to support a higher number of people getting unemployment benefits because you've slashed government investment in areas like infrastructure and housing simply isn't sustainable. Now is exactly the time for government to make the investments that we need in infrastructure, in health, in our environment, so that we're creating jobs and getting New Zealand moving again. Anchor projects funded by government have helped us get through major economic shocks before, like the rollout of broadband during the global financial crisis. They create jobs, they stimulate the economy, and they leave a positive legacy for the future. Yet all we've seen from this government so far is big talk about a pipeline of projects that's yet to eventuate. In fact, the opposite has happened. Last year, the government spent less on infrastructure, less on investment, than it did the year before. All the big talk around fixing up our infrastructure is actually resulting in less action right at the time when we need to see more. Talking about growth and economic growth without actually having a plan to deliver it just doesn't cut it. We need to get New Zealand back to work, just as we've done before, and that is what a Labour government will focus on. Let's be frank, we didn't get everything right when we were in government, but I also want to put a few facts on the table. GDP per person grew by $18,000 under the last Labour government. That's higher GDP growth per person than under the Clark or Key governments, despite the fact that we were in office for 3 years less than those predecessors. Let's talk about wages. If we go back to the Bulger-Shipley government, ordinary hourly pay for New Zealanders on average grew by $3.30 over 9 years. Under the Clark government, it grew by double that at $7.22. And under the Key and English governments, it grew by $6.29. Under the government of myself and Jacinda Ardern, it grew by $9.98. We grew the economy faster, we lifted wages faster, we created more jobs, and unemployment was lower. So when the government tells you that there is no alternative to cuts, don't believe it. There is. But it's not just about numbers, it's also about values. If you're genuinely going to turn things around and provide New Zealanders with hope and opportunity for a better future, then the budget this year needs to do, at a minimum, 3 things. First, it'll need to properly fund our frontline public services like health, education, aged care, the police, and so on. National promised New Zealanders before the last election that frontline public services would not be cut. Yet we've seen hiring freezes in health, cuts to specialist teachers, very cruel cuts to those who rely on support for disabilities. All of these serve as examples that simply wasn't true. The second thing the government will need to do in this year's budget is provide a credible answer for how they're going to fund all of their promises. And that should not be at the expense of working New Zealand women. They've committed billions of dollars to infrastructure, for example, but they still haven't told the country how they're going to pay for that. The third thing they need to show is that they've got a plan to invest in our future, to rebuild our ageing schools, hospitals, state houses and infrastructure, to create jobs, upskill our workers and raise wages and living standards. Because fundamentally, good economic management is about people. Shifting numbers around on a page while making life harder for everyday working Kiwis is not a sign of success. How can we look our kids in the eye when we give a $3 billion tax breaks to landlords whilst cutting funding for food banks? How can we justify increasing returns for landlords while we cut the pay of those who clean our hospitals and who teach in our schools? We can't, we won't, we shouldn't. Labour isn't anti-wealth, we're anti-poverty, and we're pro-opportunity for everyone. We believe in a fair tax system, and you are going to hear more from us on that very soon. Not to punish success, but to ask those who have benefited the most to contribute their fair share to the schools that taught them, the roads that connect them, and the hospitals that care for their families. Because you cannot build a strong economy on a weak society. We want to build a country where our kids don't feel they have to leave New Zealand to build a life for themselves. Where our elders can live with dignity. Where no child goes hungry. Where our businesses thrive. Where being a nurse, a teacher, or a farmer isn't a path to burnout, but a path to pride. We want New Zealand to be a place where our best and brightest don't just want to stay, but they can stay. Because there's opportunity here, hope here, a future here. We know that future is going to test us. Artificial intelligence is going to change the way we work. Climate change is going to challenge the way we live. New technologies are going to transform our industries and our workplaces. But these aren't reasons to fear the future. They're reasons to shape the future. And that's exactly what a Labour government will do. We want to invest in green energy and the industries of tomorrow. We have to reform our education system so that we're preparing our young people for the jobs of the future, not the jobs of the 19th century. We need to make sure that new technologies benefit everyone, not just the few. We need to build homes, not sell them off. We need to protect our environment, not carve it up and privatise it. And we need to focus on uniting the country, not driving division. Because diversity is not a weakness, it's our greatest strength. Whether you're Māori, Pakeha, Pacifica, Asian, or new to this land, you're all Kiwis. Whether you're a nurse in Palmerston North, a teacher in Otaki, a small business owner in Timaru, a cleaner in South Auckland, a builder in Rotorua, or a farmer in Wairoa, your contributions all matter. Whether you're young or old, rich or poor, gay, straight or transgender, We see you, hear you, and we will fight for you. Because what unites us as a country is far greater than what divides us. We're a nation of workers and dreamers, of creators and carers. We believe in fairness, in decency, and in community. And we believe the role of government is not to sit on the sidelines, it's to step up, to help, and to serve. This government's making different choices, choosing a lucky few over all of the rest of us. And those choices show us more than anything what kind of country this government wants to build. But the question we all have to ask ourselves is that the country we really want? A broken health system, children going to school hungry, people sleeping in cars. A generation, our kids, growing up believing that they'll never be able to own their own home, they won't raise their family here, they won't build their future here. Or do we want a New Zealand where everybody gets a fair go? Where the dignity of work is restored, the promise of opportunity is renewed, and the bonds of community are rebuilt. We're not here to manage decline. We're here to build the future. A future where prosperity is shared and where nobody gets left behind. Where we choose hope over fear. Where we can say to the next generation, yes, you can dream here, you can build here, and you can stay here. We've done that before as a country and we can do it again. We need to build a better way and we need to do that together. Kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui. Thank you. Right, happy to go straight to questions.
You said that there'll be a fairer tax plan from Labor released very soon. How soon will that be?
Soon.
What does that mean?
Well, I'll tell you when we're ready.
Can we have a little bit more specificity in terms of the things that you're looking at?
I think it's already very clear what we're looking at. We're looking at how you make sure that people who are earning significant amounts of money outside of the PAYE system are paying their fair share of tax.
You already have increased the top tax rate to 39%. You're looking at shifting that up even further?
I'm not making any announcements on tax. I'm saying we're looking at a fairer tax system, and I've also said that it'll be this year that we'll set out what that looks like.
If you do a capital gains tax, would that preclude you from reinstating interest deductibility as you had it last time?
The goal will be to answer all of those questions broadly at the same time so that people know what we're proposing to do. Well, when we make our tax policy, we will need to be able to answer all of those questions, and we will.
Right, but it's sort of one of those things that surely a capital gains tax would you couldn't do both?
Look, I'm not going to speculate on what our tax policy may be. I'm telling you that we will announce that in due course.
Yeah, but you are the Labor Party. It's going to be a capital gains tax, isn't it?
We are the Labor Party. Yeah, we want to make sure that the workers of New Zealand don't pay a disproportionate share of the tax.
Your GDP your GDP per capita figure in the speech looked like a non-inflation adjusted figure. Is it accurate to say that you grew the economy on a per person basis faster than previous governments when a lot of that nominal growth was thanks to inflation?
No, I mean you can choose any number of numbers. In that particular case, I'm quite comfortable with the numbers that we chose. Yes, we did see a spike in inflation at the end, though. I've never been blind to that.
I guess the issue though is you're using that figure to suggest that people got richer on a per person basis under your government when it's then other governments, when actually a lot of that nominal growth was just because...
Well, salary and wages also grew faster as well, so I don't agree with you on that.
But I mean, even those minimum wage figures, I think you're only a couple of dollars ahead of what Helen Clark hiked the minimum wage by, and in inflation-adjusted terms, you would have been lower.
By the end of our term, certainly there was more that we needed to do around inflation. So things like the minimum wage, for example, the current government haven't increased the minimum wage to compensate for inflation. We would have, and we're pretty clear about that.
You weren't really that specific about what you want to see the government do in this budget. You had three sort of points. What specifically would you like to see Nicola Willis be announcing? A specific policy, a specific budget line in the budget next week?
Well, I mean, I think, as I said, investments in the future. I think that if you look at the first and the third tests that I put there, I think some of those anchor projects, for example, would satisfy those. So what are the things that they're going to do that are going to bring forward investment now rather than decrease investment? Because despite all of their rhetoric, investment's actually decreased over the last 18 months, not increased.
You talked about unleashing public investment in a 2020. In a future Labor government, what would that look like? What projects would you like to see the government invest in?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's difficult to speculate on that now because we don't know what the government's going to announce in this year's budget or next year's budget. But as we get closer to the election, we'll have a more specific list that we'll put out there of things that we want to see brought forward. But it's impossible to do that now because, we don't know what the overall state of the government's books will be heading into the next election campaign, and we also don't know what the government may decide to do or not to do between now and then.
Do you have any idea what you'd like to see now?
Oh, look, we've got ideas, but there's no point in sharing those yet.
Chris Hipkins, you've been, Labor Party's obviously been running a pretty fulsome campaign, including through social media, on the pay equity, on the pay equity situation. You came at it straight out of the gate today. And one of the things that you guys are claiming is that the government's given a bunch of groups a pay cut. That's not strictly true, though, is it?
Well, if you look at the Prime Minister's statements yesterday about his own pay, he seemed to regard any suggestion that he wouldn't get a pay increase as a pay cut. He doesn't seem to have that view when it comes to women's pay.
Yeah, but I'm asking about there's plenty to oppose about this bill without being misleading about it.
If you're taking away money that women otherwise would have got in their pay, I think most people would regard that as a pay cut.
You talked about how the government should be making investments, particularly with the weak economy. It's quite popular economic theory, but do you accept any responsibility for what we call pro-cyclical spending? Because you spent too much, or not you specifically, but the Labor government spent too much when the economy was hot. That sort of necessitates cost cutting when the economy is weak. Do you accept any responsibility for causing that pro-cyclical?
I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of the forecasts during COVID were badly wrong. So, identifying when the economy needed more pro-cyclical spending or, counter-cyclical spending was actually very difficult during COVID. The central banks across the world got it wrong in terms of their views on what they needed to do. New Zealand's Reserve Bank was not unique. Every central bank got that wrong. So I think it just showed that throughout COVID, if you could go back and do it again, there'd be a series of different decisions I think almost any government in the world would make. But none of us had that information at the time.
You were speaking about debt in your speech. Would the Labour Party implement sort of like you previously did in government with the responsibility rules that you had around debt and government spending? Would you return to that sort of mantra?
As I said, we've got to have a more mature conversation about debt, because if you look at the huge amount of infrastructure that the government wants to see New Zealand invest in, the current government want to see New Zealand invest in, there's no way they're going to be able to do that out of day-to-day consumption. It's going to have to involve long-term financing, i.e. debt. And even if you're using PPPs as part of your financing model, which they've said they won't do, that's still a form of debt. So I think we need to recognise that we've got a lot that we need to invest in as a country. The real question is, where is that debt being applied? If it's being applied to day-to-day consumption, i.e. unemployment benefits, that's not something that's sustainable. If it's being applied to invest in things that we will get a long-term return from, then that can be sustainable. It's like the difference between increasing your mortgage to pay the power bill or increasing your mortgage to extend the house. One's justifiable, the other gets you into trouble.
But could you be very specific as to what you mean by Labour we need to have a more mature discussion around debt? Is that you saying that we need to be more open to taking on more debt as a country?
Taking on debt for the right reasons. Taking on debt because the budget's not balanced, that's not the right reason, but taking on debt because we're fixing up our infrastructure and we're investing in things that over 30, 40 years we will get a return from, that is something that we need to talk about.
So should the government be cutting further to get an overgale surplus?
Nope, not arguing that.
So no. But you're just saying that one's not sustainable, and currently there's deficits that are running that are for ongoing spending. If
you follow the cycle that Nicola Willis has got the country in, where you're targeting a percentage of government spend, GDP as a government spend as a percentage of GDP, and the cost of that is that you slow economic growth, the amount you have to cut in order to meet that target continues to go up. So she's actually got us locked in a cycle where she's having to cut more to meet an arbitrary target, which she herself is pushing us further away from.
So what would be your alternative approach to dig that surplus?
Well, I think getting the economy growing again through things that actually get the economy growing, and just talking about it doesn't, that's got to be one of the first ports of call.
It's not an arbitrary number though, is it? Because, at the moment we're paying anywhere between $8 and $10 billion worth of interest on the debt. If you take on more debt, we're paying more interest.
We've still got some of the lowest debt servicing costs in the world.
But it's still debt.
That's going to click up at some point.
It's going to have to. But it's going to have to regardless, because the government has still got to borrow effectively to invest in the things they say they're going to do. They've put out multi-billion-dollar plans for roading. They still haven't told the country how they're going to pay for that. Now, they're going to have to borrow to pay for the majority of that. So why not do that now, rather than pay more people to sit at home on an unemployment benefit?
Your critics are going to take these comments and say this is same old Labour looking to just borrow more and spend more. What would be your reaction to that?
We're doing the opposite. We're actually saying that we need to borrow to invest rather than borrow for day-to-day consumption, which is exactly what this government are doing. They're borrowing more because they've got more people on an unemployment benefit, because they're not investing in the stuff that we need to invest in as a country.
What is an anchor project, and what could that mean?
So anchor projects can be a whole variety of things. As I said, broadband was one of the anchor projects of the previous national government. Ultra-fast broadband was one. Some of the roading projects that they had, roads of national significance in their first iteration, were among the anchor projects that government had. If you go back to our government, we would say things like the shovel-ready projects, the Provincial Growth Fund, the work we were doing around hospitals, some of the vertical infrastructure, hospital buildings and the like. Those things can be anchor projects that help to stimulate the economy, create jobs, and therefore reduce the amount that you need to spend on things like unemployment benefits.
So it doesn't need to be really big, like, Auckland Light Rail was going to be huge.
Yeah.
You're not promising or encouraging something like that?
Auckland's going to need mass rapid transit at some point, but the reality is it's going to, as we discovered, it's going to take a while before you get to the point where you're actually building it. So we need to focus on the things that we can build now. One of the reasons we were doing things like hospitals and schools is because they can actually be brought to the market relatively quickly.
How high are you willing to let New Zealand's debt bill get?
We'll set out our fiscal plan before the election, which will set out a different approach to the current government's.
In your speech, you talked about that this government's keen on privatising things. What's the government privatising?
Well, the Prime Minister himself hasn't revealed that yet, but he said that he's open to it.
So they've got a secret plan to privatise?
Well, they're just not telling people what it is. They may not have even formulated it yet, but they've said that they're open to privatising things.
It's a bit cheeky, isn't it?
So it's accurate to say they're actually privatising things?
Well, no, they've put it on the table, so now they need to explain what exactly it is they're proposing to privatise.
But can I ask, what are you expecting to see from this year's budget, and what has Labor build in the background without giving away too much specifically?
The first question I'll be asking when we go into that budget lock-up is what have they cut to pay for this? And so specifically we've seen the billions of dollars apparently that they're savings through the pay equity, cancelling those 33 claims. We will be keeping a sharp eye out to see what has been cut to pay for what they're going to be offering.
You talked about solar panels and said that the regulation was a little bit onerous. Cutting regulation is one way to drive the economic growth you're talking about. Is that something the coalition is working on? Is that something you'd be interested in continuing if you came into government, some sort of deregulation?
In the right areas. So I think we need to proceed with caution. So you still have to have good protections, public protections in place through your regulatory system. I'm currently in the process of looking at exactly why it is cheaper to install solar panels in Australia than in New Zealand, because I think those are the sorts of things that we need to look at.
It's interesting, you talk to almost any sector and they all say we're over-regulated. Do you think that New Zealand has gone too far? Are we too cautious?
We've got to make sure we're regulating the right things and removing the regulation that isn't serving its purpose. The world's changing dramatically, very fast. Technological solutions are available for problems that weren't even 18 months ago, and we have to make sure we're keeping up with that.
Do you expect that you'd keep the Ministry of Regulation should you become Prime Minister in a couple of years?
Well, look, I mean, the jury's still out on that, to be frank. Haven't made a call on that. But David Seymour saying we need a Ministry for Regulation, but it shouldn't apply to any decisions that he makes, highlights that there's a bit of a pitfall there.
Do you think you're going to find a sympathetic ear in Chris Bishop when it comes to your conversations around wanting to cut down the use of urgency and extend the sitting out?
Oh, not based on the public comments that he's made. But I think, it's more of a technical conversation, but I think increasing the ability for Parliament to sit without the use of urgency, so you can extend Parliament sitting hours, would actually naturally cut down on the amount of urgency. If you look, there's a difference between passing bills through all stages under urgency without any sort of scrutiny and using urgency to extend Parliament sitting hours. Governments do both. If you took out the latter, the number of hours, the amount of urgency would reduce quite a lot. Are
you pushing for a case-by-case basis, or something as broad-reaching as sort of question time starts at 12 o'clock and the House finishes sitting at 10 o'clock?
So, again, this is probably a bit boring for most people.
It's the right audience.
Yeah, but at the moment the government can use extended sitting one morning a week, but only one morning a week. If you said the government could use extended sitting multiple mornings and on a Friday, then actually that would knock out probably at least half of the urgency, because you could just extend Parliament sitting hours, you'd get the extra time you need without having to resort to urgency.
Your MPs behind coming back to Parliament on Fridays?
Well, you end up doing that anyway, because if you go into urgency, you end up bringing them back on a Friday. Giving the government the ability to do that without needing to use urgency means all of those safeguards around the legislative process about doing things one step at a time and having adequate gaps between each, you would allow for that without the need for urgency. Cool. Very good. Thank you. See you all again in an hour or two.